All right, ready to dive into some Cold War history?
Always.
This time, we're cracking open The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen.
Oh, yeah, that one's a classic.
Yeah.
Published back in 58, right?
Right in the thick of it. And Skousen, he didn't hold back. He really wanted to lay bare what he saw as the true nature of communism.
No punches pulled.
Not at all. Origins, goals, impact, the whole 9 yards,
Yeah.
especially how it played out, with the U.S. and the USSR.
A real product of its time, trying to cut through the propaganda and show communism as this immediate existential threat.
Exactly. And he starts by taking us straight to the source, the founders, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
Those are names everyone's heard, sure.
But Skousen goes deeper than just, their theories, right? He wants to show them as people. Their personalities, what drove them.
Humanizing them, almost. Which is interesting for a book trying to demonize their ideology.
It is. One thing that stuck with me was how he talks about Marx's personal struggle, money problems, constantly.
It makes you think, right? The father of communism always broke. Skousen describes his family living in poverty, 8 kids, while he's writing his manifestos.
Wow. It paints this picture of a guy driven by ideas, yeah, but maybe also some resentment. The system failed him.
Yeah, you can almost see that personal experience fueling his revolutionary fire.
Totally. But there's this other bit I found fascinating about Mikhail Bakunin, first Russian revolutionary, as Skousen tells it.
Okay, I vaguely remember him. Wasn't he, kicked out of the Communist Club?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Marx booted him from the International Workingmen's Association. Big drama. But here's the thing. Even after that, Bakunin was still a huge believer in Marx's ideas.
Diehard fan.
Total convert. And he even translated Marx's works into Russian.
Hold on, that little detail. That's huge when you think about it.
Right. That's what I thought.
If those translations hadn't happened, Marxism might have stayed this obscure Western thing. But Bakunin brought it to Russia.
And boom, set the stage for, everything that followed. Russia becoming the first communist state.
Crazy how these seemingly small things can snowball.
Total chain reaction. But okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts of this philosophy, right? Skousen spends a lot of time on dialectical materialism. Sounds intimidating.
It's a mouthful, that's for sure.
It's one of those things where you're like, I think I get it.
You kind of have to break it down. Imagine, 2 magnets, right, pushing and pulling against each other.
Okay, I'm with you.
That's how Marx and Engels saw the world. Constant struggle between these opposing forces. That struggle is what they call dialectical, and the driving force, material conditions, stuff like economics.
Ah, so it's not just ideas clashing, it's about real-world stuff that underpins it all.
Exactly. Skousen gets into the weeds with this, talking about a law of opposites, law of negation, law of transformation.
So the idea is that everything's in conflict, always pushing towards change.
Right. And for Marx and Engels, that's what drives history forward. Inevitably, they thought this leads to revolution, the working class rising up, overthrowing the system.
And creating a classless society, no state, all that.
Exactly. Skousen hammers home that this vision of revolution, this world turned upside down, it's the core of communist ideology.
And from there, he takes us to Russia to see how this all actually played out. Starts with those revolutions, 1905, then March 1917.
Tsar's gone. Chaos everywhere.
Setting the stage for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And things get real dark real fast.
Skousen pulls no punches, describing the Russian Civil War, the famine, all the executions that came after, the human cost, trying to actually build this communist utopia.
It's stark. And what's interesting is Skousen even points out that Lenin himself, he had to deviate from some of Marx's original ideas.
Oh, well, so.
Lenin realized Russia wasn't industrialized enough for, pure Marxism to work, had to make adjustments.
Pragmatism kicking in.
But according to Skousen, those adjustments didn't make things any less brutal. He talks about the Red Terror purging anyone who was seen as a threat.
Sobering reminder that these abstract theories could have very, very real consequences.
Absolutely. And then, of course, comes Stalin, who, in Skousen's telling, basically amps up the repression and violence tenfold.
5-year plans, forced collectivization, the famine in Ukraine, the purges.
It's like this snowball of terror just keeps rolling. And for Skousen, this is what solidifies the image of communism, right? This totalitarian threat. And that image, it's stuck with the West for decades.
It becomes the defining image of communism.
What I found fascinating is how Skousen then ties this all back to World War II. You know, those pacts Stalin made first with Hitler, then with Japan.
Applying both sides.
Yeah, exactly. And Skousen argues it's all part of this grand strategy, right, to advance communist interests.
But it was a risky game for sure.
Oh, totally. Skousen points out how Stalin miscalculated, big time. The Soviets were totally unprepared for when Hitler turned on them.
Relied heavily on aid from the U.S., ironically. Lend-Lease program and all that.
It creates this weird situation. The U.S. is helping a country that, according to Skousen, wants to destroy them in the long run.
Planting the seeds of the Cold War, even while fighting side by side.
Exactly. And then there's the founding of the United Nations, right? Skousen sees this as another example of that underlying tension.
How so?
He points to the Soviet Union demanding veto power in the Security Council.
Ah, yeah. The ability to just shut down anything they didn't like. Skousen sees that as a sign of things to come.
Like the cracks in this alliance, they're already showing, even before the war is over. And then, boom, 1949, China falls to communism.
Huge turning point.
Absolutely. Skousen really emphasizes how significant this was. A massive win for the Soviets and a turning point in the Cold War. He's super critical of the U.S. response, too, specifically that State Department white paper they put out.
Trying to explain how they lost China.
Yeah. But Skousen argues that it ignored tons of evidence about what the communists were really up to, like they were downplaying the threat.
So basically, the U.S. wasn't taking the communist challenge seriously enough.
That's Skousen's point. China was a wake-up call, a sign that this wasn't just some far-off problem.
It was at their doorstep. And that's when Skousen shifts focus to the U.S. itself. He starts talking about a different kind of communist threat, one that's more insidious.
This is where those really compelling stories come in, like Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley.
Oh yeah, the former American communists.
Yeah.
Turned against the party and blew the whistle on these Soviet spy rings operating right inside the U.S. government.
Like something out of a movie. Alger Hiss, high up in the State Department, accused of being a Soviet agent. Skousen really highlights the FBI's role here under J. Edgar Hoover, trying to root out this internal threat.
Feeds into that Cold War paranoia, right? Communists could be anywhere, even in your own government.
It's unsettling. And that feeling, that unease, it runs through Skousen's whole book. So we left off talking about this 45-point plan that Skousen lays out. Supposedly straight from communist sources, right?
Yeah. It's a wild blueprint, how to infiltrate and weaken America. From the inside out. It's so specific, it's almost like a checklist.
Right, like infiltrate labor unions, control the media. Some of it's almost like, is this a conspiracy theory? But then again, you think about that Cold War fear.
It was real, this idea that communism wasn't just some external enemy. It could rot you from within.
Totally. So how does Skousen say we fight this?
He has a whole bunch of recommendations. For regular people, teachers, businessmen, even the government. What's interesting is how much he stresses individual action. Like, it's not just up to the government to protect us.
We all have skin in the game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Understand communist ideology, recognize their tactics, and push back wherever you can. He talks a lot about education, both in terms of, teaching people about free enterprise, but also teaching kids about the dangers of communism.
He's really concerned about education, almost like schools are this battleground for hearts and minds. What does he say teachers should do? Specifically?
Be super vigilant, like watch out for communist ideas in the classroom, counter them, present a balanced view of history, make sure kids know about the failures of communism, the atrocities, and instill a love of freedom, democracy, all that.
So it's not just about teaching ABCs and 123s, it's about shaping how kids see the world. Big responsibility.
Huge. And Skousen sees teachers as, like, frontline soldiers in this ideological war. He even gives them a reading list. Books to help them understand communism better.
Wow. So it's like an intellectual arms race, arming teachers with knowledge to fight back against ideas.
That's a good way to put it. It makes you wonder how much of that was actually happening. Were teachers having these debates in their classrooms?
Right. I mean, the fear of communist infiltration was everywhere, so it makes sense that it would reach into schools, too.
Totally. And Skousen doesn't stop there. He also has some choice words for businessmen.
What does he want them to do?
Wake up. He thought a lot of businessmen were naive about the threat, dismissing it as like just a political problem or something. He wanted them to be proactive, watch out for communist tactics in their own companies, support anti-communist initiatives.
Interesting. He links the fight against communism to free enterprise, like a healthy capitalist system is the best antidote.
Yeah, he sees them as two sides of the same coin. Capitalism versus communism. One wins, the other loses.
But his most controversial stuff is aimed at the government.
Oh, yeah, he goes all in, thinks the U.S. is being way too soft on the Soviets. Appeasement, he calls it. Not doing enough to contain communism.
What does he want them to do?
Get tough. He advocates for some pretty extreme measures. Cut off diplomatic relations with the Soviets and their allies, no more trade, no more aid. Launch a massive propaganda campaign to show the world how bad communism really is.
It's like Cold War 2.0, total confrontation.
Basically. He thinks you can't defeat communism by being nice. You got to expose it, show its weaknesses, and prove that the American way is better.
But wasn't there a worry that this would just escalate things, like lead to an actual hot war?
I'm sure people were worried. But Skousen seems to think the risks of doing nothing were worse. Appeasement just emboldens the enemy, in his view.
It's a glimpse into that Cold War mindset, that fear of communist expansion, and this conviction that America had to stop it no matter what.
And it's a debate that's still relevant, in a way. How to handle authoritarian regimes, right? Diplomacy versus force, these are still questions we grapple with.
So, big question. Are Skousen's ideas still useful today? I mean, the Cold War's over, the Soviet Union's gone.
It's complicated, but a lot of the themes he touches on, they're still around. Ideological conflict, propaganda, the power of individuals to make a difference.
Maybe not a communist threat in the same way, but definitely threats to democracy, freedom of speech.
Exactly. So even though his book is from another time, it still has things to teach us about being vigilant, thinking critically, being active citizens, defending the things we believe in.
It's a reminder that the fight for a just society, it never really ends. We have to stay engaged.
Well put.
Okay, so we've covered Skousen's analysis, his recommendations. Now, I want to talk about the book's legacy. How did people react when it came out?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting. It made some waves.
Let's hear it. So, The Naked Communist hits the shelves. What happens?
It takes off, becomes a bestseller, especially with conservatives.
Makes sense. It really fed into those Cold War anxieties.
Totally. In Skousen's style, it's very readable, he's just talking to you, explaining these complex things in a simple way. Plus, he's a good storyteller.
Yeah, I noticed that. Mixes history, personal stories, those dire warnings. It's effective. Makes it feel urgent.
Like a call to action.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people back then, that's what they needed. A way to make sense of this scary world and feel like they could actually do something about it.
But I bet not everyone was thrilled.
Oh, there was pushback, for sure. Mostly from the left, they saw it as alarmist, McCarthyite, full of exaggerations.
Yeah, some of those claims are pretty out there. The 45-point plan, especially.
Right. Critics said he was oversimplifying communism, ignoring the nuances, and just stirring up paranoia and fear.
So basically, the book became this mirror for the political divide.
Exactly. Depending on your views, it was either a brilliant expose or dangerous propaganda. But the impact went beyond that initial controversy.
How so?
It stayed influential, especially among conservatives. Even after the Cold War ended, it was still seen as this foundational text, like the Anti-Communist Bible.
Wild. A book from 1958 still having that kind of power. What do you think explains that?
Part of it, I think, is that Skousen speaks to these deep fears that don't really go away. Like the fear of being undermined from within, losing your values, your freedom.
It's like he put a name to those anxieties a lot of people were feeling.
Exactly. And he gave them a story, a bad guy, and a way to fight back. That's powerful stuff, especially when the world feels uncertain.
So even though it's very much a product of the Cold War, it still raises questions that are relevant about national security, cultural identity, the role of government.
Totally. And that's what makes it worth reading, even today. Whether you agree with Skousen or not, it makes you think about these big issues. Freedom, how to protect it, what it means to be a citizen in a world where ideas can have such huge consequences.
It's a reminder that the fight for a better society, it never stops. We got to stay aware, stay engaged, and keep fighting for the things we believe in.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. The Naked Communist, definitely a fascinating and sometimes unsettling look back at a pivotal moment in history.
It really is. We saw how communist ideology developed, those Cold War anxieties, and just how powerful ideas can be in shaping the world.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with this. If Skousen was right and communism exploited weaknesses in free societies, what are our vulnerabilities today? What can we do, each of us, to make our community stronger and protect those freedoms we value?
That's the question we all have to grapple with. Because the future really does depend on us being willing to have those tough conversations, to think critically, and to work together to build a more just world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.